I am really very grateful for this invitation, although a little perplexed, since I am not a great transmedial person. I haven't worked extensively in that field, and I'm not really a great semiotics person either. I wonder why I'm here. I have, however, the honor and the privilege of almost being in Tartu. As a student of comparative literature back in the 1970s, I read with fascination and considerable awe the works of Lotman and later Lotman and Uspensky, Tartu, Moscow School of Semiotics. And it opened my eyes to something beyond what comparative literature was at that stage. You just, look up at the top shelf, as they say in the wine shops, to where the good stuff is, and think on a higher level of cultures and civilizations and the world as signs. It was an introduction to serious theoretical thought. And I was pleased to start Lotman and learn from him in my early days. I didn't, however, stay there. And it occurs to me now, having listened to some of you over the past 3 days, and I obviously couldn't listen to all of you, that I'm a bit like somebody who's watched a house across the road grow. I sort of saw the foundations being laid somehow, and I've never been inside your house. And now you've given me the honor and the privilege to enter there. I have read, of course, Peter Turup's work on translation and learned from that and cited it. But I have the feeling that I'm entering a world that I should have known better and just haven't. I've been living across the street a bit. And as I come in, and I can see, if you forgive a few comments of this visitor into your house, the Northern European Russian extension is working very well, with an Italian add-on, as has always been there. And the Brazilian presence is wonderful too. I thought your house might have been bigger by now after all these years. I wonder why. Now, I'm also impressed by a lot of the discussions that I've been hearing are about categories and categorizations, about approaching extremely diverse phenomena. And the first reaction is to throw a net of terms over it and then play with the terms. That's understandable. Since we're watching systems of signs work across multiple media in many different ways with new technologies, one is struggling to get a handle on it. And the work of Peter Turup in translation studies has been the foremost in that. The desire to recognize and classify a wide range of translational activities is very much appreciated. And as you can see there with his binoculars, it enables one to look close and far at the same time. And I appreciate that as being the work of categorization and the development of concepts from categories. But is that enough? It hasn't been enough for me personally. If I look back on my career, as I approach retirement age, I really wanted to be more engaged in practice. I've spent most of my time training translators and working quite close to training situations. And recently, as you'll see, I've been looking more at language policy and translation policy as a part of that. I've needed more engagement than the relative comfort of categorization and the relative ability to see the world in abstract terms, an almost spiritual, theosophical approach to the world, which has been perforated at several key points over the past few days, and I'll come to those in a minute. This is a citation that came to me many years ago. I actually attended lectures by Audrey Lefebvre as a doctoral student about meta-language. If I may translate off the cuff, meta-language is the grand alibi for masking and forgetting about historical tasks and missions that have not yet been accomplished. for effacing responsibilities, for disseminating a latent sense of guilt, an imprecise feeling of frustration and disease. And I think that sort of sums up how I feel about the more abstract part of our activities. The conference, I'm just raising a few points before I get to my subject matter. The turn, I don't know how it is for people in transmedia studies or media studies or semiotics. Look, come on, do we need another turn? From where I am in translation studies, turns are about, there's a guy on the rack, give him another turn, see if it breaks the discipline entirely. I know Michael Cronin had a different take on it in Irish English, to have a turn means you're feeling a bit sick. And I am getting giddy at looking at the profuse number of turns that have been reported to take place in translation studies over the past 30 or so years. I'm frankly not that interested in them. I don't think it's useful to pretend that there is entirely suddenly something new and everybody should go that way or go that way. I'm far more interested in letting categories and concepts arise from the problems that we can identify and that we can help to solve in our respective societies. And looking at where I work in translation studies, I am not sure the discipline makes much sense for me these days unless we can identify deep-seated problems to be worked on. And a lot of what I see being done under the name of the various turns, quite frankly, is not doing that. And I'm correspondingly less interested. However, there are turns and they are related to media. And I can point to them empirically. I like to do empirical work. I like to get more than just abstract concepts and a few anecdotes and off you go. I want to know more about what people are doing without believing that they're telling the truth. But here's a way of knowing what they're doing. I'm looking here at the creation of associations of translators and interpreters over since 1890 to 2010 or so. And you can see there's been a lot of them. Now, what translators and interpreters have done as collectivities is divide themselves up according to media or ways of using media. There you see the breakaway of literary translators who decided they didn't want to be with the rest. Court interpreters and translators have similarly decided they don't want to be with the rest, especially after 2000, when they've been hit with waves of outsourcing and relative deprofessionalization. Unionization has been one response to that. Conference interpreters have separated. The big one is the AIC up the top there. But look at the number of smaller associations that have been created. And right at the end there, we have got, I think, 6 associations of audiovisual translators. What this tells me is that there are things like turns, that people working in these industries, doing the job, have decided to band together in ways that are calqued on media, more or less, and that turn their back on the one identification of translators and interpreters as a great collectivity which can discuss the issues common to it. There has been this relative fragmentation in the industry, and that has been followed by relative fragmentation in studies based, however indirectly, on that industry. So I shouldn't be surprised to see appeals to turns, although I can still be dismayed, both with respect to the industry and with respect to studies on it. I want to also make the point that media have always been at the heart of what can be done in mediated communication. So you can map out a very rough history of translation and interpreting, going back to multimedia performance, as in an Indigenous corroboree in Australia, I've written on the age of paper and how paper enabled a discussion and revision prior to translations being written down. The age of print for me is the establishment of a text to which one can be faithful and then later equivalent. And it's not surprising to me to find that the theories of faithfulness and equivalence belong to print, starting from Etienne Dolet, who was a printer, of course. I've seen the spread of what was then the Western translation form based on fidelity, faithfulness, equivalence, spread out thanks to steam technologies, ships, trains, the steam printing press. And we have these days electronic media that enable us to go beyond the fixity of the start text, and we find a sort of return to the multimedia display of variation that one found prior to print. You can see translation activities on that kind of history as depending to a certain extent on the possibilities that media have presented and responding in various ways in various situations. So one of the books that we did 2 years ago is looking at translation history in terms of the trust relationships that are enabled by these various technologies. That's not something I'm going into today, but it's a valid background, I think. Now, where this conference has gone beyond the categories is in the examples. I think that Lars Elleström's wonderful presentation picked up climate change as an example, and Tom Leach did something similar with the example of divided trust in American society these days. I propose, ladies and gentlemen, that these are not just examples of wider phenomena. Well, it's partly of wider phenomena, but they're examples of what I want to call here behavior change communication. Communication that is designed to change the behavior of the receiver. Behavior change communication, if you look it up, it's generally associated with programs for HIV, vaccination. At the University of Melbourne, have been involved in a program to get families to maintain their non-English languages. So behavior change communication for language maintenance. The big one this year, ladies and gentlemen, COVID-19, full of behavior change communication. And the even bigger one is what is now called the climate emergency. Now, these are not just examples because they are incredibly important for survival. And they are communication acts of a particular kind that I'll come to in a minute, and with dissenting voices. They depend, as you can see, on trust. And for every pandemic, you have an infodemic that can take that information down different paths. The problem is that behavior change communication depends on collective cooperative action. We can learn a lot from publicity. I've been looking at publicity and seeing what they say about the role of image, the role of slogans, the role of music. Publicity is to get the individual to change. Here, in all these points, you require more than the individual. You require collective cooperative action. And to do that, you require a very high degree of collective trust. I insist that that's the same for language maintenance. An individual cannot maintain a language. You need others around you. For fighting a pandemic, you need collective action, quite obviously. And climate change cannot be reversed if it's just one country or two. It has to be coordinated and collective. On all these levels, though, trust is required in expert knowledge that is, quite frankly, not available, not immediately available to the people who are required to act, in the sense that we cannot pretend to understand the medicine behind COVID-19. We can try and get a lot of ideas about it, but at some point, most of us just have to trust science or someone mediating science for us. That mediation is what interests me. To what extent do we want to associate that with a degree of truth? And truth has been a constant theme over the past 3 days, and that has been rather surprising. I'm going to draw a little on Baudrillard, who might respond to Lars Ellerstrom's wonderful first talk, where it was argued there is no fictionality, only degrees and kinds of truthfulness. And we found something like that yesterday in the plenary. Baudrillard would have replied, well, no, there is no truthfulness, only degrees and kinds of simulacra. And that simulacra, the representation of something, the simulation of something, is what is acting in the world of our social relations, and we should forget about any claim to absolute truth or even relative truth, as has been the case here. What interests me in behavior change communication is that there are all sorts of simulacra working because nobody understands the science, and we have to trust something that is fundamentally invisible to us. And yet there is a referent, and the referent is basically survival. Or as Spivak puts it, talking about the planetary, the attempt to have a conversation with a thing that simply will not respond to us. There is some kind of referent there that is more profound and goes beyond Baudrillard's acceptance that there are only simulacra. At base, as anybody working on climate change will tell you, the argument or the understanding has to be that the things at stake are so important that even though they are probabilistic, as science is, they are so important that trust has to partake of a wager, akin to Pascal's wager on the existence of God. It's so important that we have to buy into this and trust this, because if the predictions are correct, we have to act now, collectively and cooperatively. One can do this via coercion, but it is better, I think, to do this via communication acts that achieve cooperation on the basis of trust and some degree of acceptance. To do that, you require many things, and in previous years, or recent years, I've been looking at these particular kinds of things that are necessary for non-coercive behavior change communication. And some of these have been picked up in the recent days, especially trust. So I will pay some attention to that. What I would like to insist on here, though, is that the kind of work I'm doing is the communicative act to achieve an action that is downstream towards the future. I'm less and less concerned with the backward representation that one might associate with semiosis as the interpreted as a representation of what was prior to it, or modeling, as we heard earlier on. I'm looking downstream at what can happen as a result of communication. I do this empirically. That is, I like to get data on how real people who have names and bodies, respond to certain surveys, questions, discussion groups especially, answers to questions that have no correct answer, indications of trust and distrust. These are the sorts of methodologies that we've been carrying out. I'm reporting now for the next few minutes on a study that we're doing collectively on the elderly in the Chinese, Greek, and Italian speaking communities in Melbourne, which is where I've been for most of this year. It's based on interviews with caregivers and the analysis of public debates. I'm not in charge of this project, but it's a team led by John Hadjic, who works in language maintenance and social linguistics, with people from health education, and yes, there are one or two from translation studies. So this is the activity that I'll be reporting on at the moment, okay? The problem for translation studies when facing this is that we need to get people involved in it, get some attention involvement, which requires trust. The little that we do know about translation as a language tends to suggest that it's pretty damn boring. These would be the tendencies that Gilles Levy associated, later called universals. We know that translation has less lexical variation. It works less on the extremes of language use. It tends to be highly normalized. If I do my risk analysis, translators tend to take fewer communicative risks than non-translators. And so if we're trying to grab attention, we have the deck stacked against us from the beginning. Thinking about this, I worked through Luhmann, but back to, this is actually Descartes, to this category of admiratio, the first of the passions, if you like, that we're attracted to something before we even know if it's convenable, if it's good for us or not. It has no opposite. It's like, oh, what is there? I must pay attention to this. And you're going to need that to get any behavior change. That's the first thing you need is admiratio, or a call to attention. I use this in class. I say, well, look, you might have 1, 2, or 1.5 written languages, and we think we're pretty good if we've got a few other languages. And here you are, a translator working multilingually. You're great. You've got all these conceptual spaces that you can play with. But hey, in Melbourne, there are 250 languages spoken at home, a little more. So you just know that little bit of what's going on around us in the city. If you put yourself among the 6,000 or more languages spoken in the world, that's how much you can work with and know. And then if you spread that over 350,000 years of language, there's a dot in there somewhere for what you know. And I do that so that translators can think about how to draw attention to receivers and say, I'm going to give you something from this vast expanse of humanity that we don't know about. We're going to bring it to you and say, there is more than you know. That's the first thing you have to do. I do that in a class where the translators are required to take a text that is a linguistic text, a written text, and put it to film and music or anything else they can come up with. And they do some really, really wonderful things. But the first thing they do is to work image into it, the priority of the image. And anybody working in medical communication, for example, here, as you can see, will tell you that the communicative act with an image has a better chance of recall than without it. If you've got a bit of music and a person there, even more. In Luhmann, this getting of attention corresponds to what he calls irritation, bearing in mind that in a system for Luhmann, there is just communication. So if you've got something happening between systems, which is what we're talking about here when we have to trust science, it's a different system. We don't really know what's going on there. It's this dependence and irritation that we're talking about, okay? The other term used there is resonance. I find this very useful for when we're doing that activity where the students are required to convert a text into multimedia format. You forget about communication. You forget about the communication of contents. Your first thing is to attract attention, and you're going to use the media to do that. After that moment, you have to do something else. I, of course, cite Beratio, but not too much. I don't want to go down that path. As I said, I believe there is more to this than simulacra, and there's more to the event than its own proof, as the images might tell you there. In our project, we found that it's incredibly important to select the correct media that people are looking at or not looking at. For example, We will put things on television, but many of the people we want to reach are not watching television, or we're going to put it on a community radio, which they do. The elderly people living in the language communities, firstly, return to their non-English language. These are the people at risk, of course. And so they are often reached through radio, which is just the voice, but the voice that they were used to in their language. And these television announcements, which are then put on the website, were not seen by anybody really that we contacted. Why? Because they're not going online and because they're not constantly on the television. This is the a channel that we have in Australia for the non-English speaking communities. Very well produced with a person there, but it's just not going to get to where these people are going to find it. It's put on the website, as I said, and those web-based translations are not going to be there. And so it doesn't attract attention. Social media for the Greek and Italian, no, that didn't work at all. They don't know how to work that. In the elderly communities, for the Chinese communities, oh yes. Over there, it has to be on WeChat and they tend to trust it. Even the elderly at age 83 will be using WeChat. So the use of media is incredibly important just to get the initial attention before anything else is done in this communicative act. Where it does happen, though, is with conversations with trusted others. This is where the trust is produced over and over. And this is what we got from the focus groups with the caregivers. We found that for many of these communities in residences for the elderly, in often church-based residences, the Italians and the Greek would have Italian and Greek television on from Greece and Italy. And they would be watching that. And they would say, no, 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 this can't be true in Melbourne because I can see over there what's happening in Rome or what's happening in Athens. But they would trust and change behavior when it was in a conversation with trusted others, usually in their own language. So I moved to trust and the incredible importance of establishing trust. By trust, I do not mean predictability. Luhmann does make a distinction between predicting what the consequences of an action will be because we've done it with this person many times. Trust for me is a condition for cooperative action, but it is always risk. It reduces complexity. I don't understand climate change. I don't understand epidemiology. I'm going to have to reduce that complexity of what I don't understand by trusting someone whom I hope does understand it. It also increases risk. When this knowledge is mediated, trust is created in different ways in different societies. At the beginning of this year, I was in Catalonia, where I work sometimes, and this is what Catalan television looks like, discussing at that stage the first signs of COVID-19. And we had journalists talking with journalists, and that is the way television creates trust in that particular society. And I moved to Australia, and you get far more academics and politicians discussing with each other and with the public, sending in questions. There's a very different social approach to the creation of trust and the development of a conversation. In Australia, you are invited to trust middle-aged white males, as you can see, one of whom is called doctor, as you can see over here, although he's not a practicing doctor, he's actually a medical journalist. And the other is called professor over here, and he has been or is the chief health officer in Victoria, where I've been living. These people are trusted because they are very good at explaining what's going on, and people do tend to believe them or revile them when people are not believing what's being said. The second one there creates what's called thick trust because he has a more developed media personality. And I'm told that all the women in Facebook dig out photos of him in his youth. And you can also buy a Brett Sutton bedspread bedspread, sorry. If you want to snuggle up with him every night, you can have Victoria's chief medical officer close to you in bed. Trust is created in those particular ways, in radio and television especially, and through the development of personalities. The distrust, however, tends to be anonymous and passing through as a kind of counterculture. So we've had profuse information about 5G as the cause of everything, and calls to civil rights that this is 1984, but we don't have names that we can attach to them, perhaps for obvious reasons, because there has been law enforcement against these movements. Where trust is really lost, though, and this is what I will come to, I have to go very quickly now. Where trust is really lost and has been lost in these communities that we're studying is in not just bad translations. It's been a massive translation project, you can imagine, for all those languages and for information that has kept changing very quickly over this period, but massive work process problems, like a message that mixes Farsi and Arabic in the one text, because nobody bothered to check that there were two languages there, and this one mixes Turkish and Bahasa Indonesia in the one text. And so that creates enormous mistrust because of some mistranslations and just hurried workflow. You get many articles like this in the press. We've had it over in recent months. And you can see that they back themselves up by citing trusted people, like a professor of translation studies at the University of Melbourne, who will tell you about the errors that are in the COVID-19 translations, mediated communication. Now, this is where it gets interesting, I think. I think that I made a decision early on. In fact, I published an article there, which was the basis of my then press activity on television and radio and doing interviews with journalists. I took the decision to insist that Australian translators are very good, because they are. And there is the world's most developed accreditation system for translators. And if you're working for the government, you are an accredited translator by law. And so I was trying to explain, look, it's a tremendously difficult situation, a lot of work, a lot of pressure. There have been these mistakes, but you have to trust the translations. Journalists didn't want to know anything about that. Everything I said was turned into a simulacrum of the opposite. It had to be that the translations were bad, and this was one of the causes of what was then our second wave, which happened to be in non-English speaking communities. And it didn't matter what I said. It was going to happen that way. I'm going to skip over things there. It didn't matter because there was this conversation going on, and the conversation was going on between this thing: translations are bad, translators are not working well, we have to fix it. So trust was lost. Trust was lost for many people there in the communities. They then reverted to what they could get from China, from Italy, from Greece in those situations. And I found this actually in Brussels, because we're doing another project with Brussels at the moment. We found that in the second wave, there was much less citizen participation and correspondingly less public trust. In fact, it started to be a blame of who is to blame for what's going on, rather than how can we fix this together. Things were lost. I think that the past year has taught me and many of us that that what is needed is not just trust in science It's not just a politician who can turn to the medical officer and say, I'm doing what he tells me or she tells me to do. So if it goes wrong, it's their fault. We've seen that anybody doing economics, political economics, psychology, I must add, parts of medicine, is also pointing to the negative effects of the various lockdowns and restrictions that we've all been going through. And that the real work of the politician has been to do a trade-off, to do a balancing act. And our different societies have done that in very, very different ways. And when that trust is lost, what breaks down is the possibility to have a wider conversation between the social groups involved in making and influencing these decisions. When that conversation can happen between different interest groups, there can be public trust and coordinated action. When not, then not. And so I'm interested in the translation as breaking down in those particular points and being at fault. Not the translation though, the perception of it. I was going to use Baudrillard, but I've been rereading Baudrillard, and it's not as good as I thought it would be. But I'm just taking this bit from his thought, okay? That in a pre-modern era, people would behave differently because there's an image of devils and hell, and we know that's an image because there's the other place and we think that's real, okay? Baudrillard then sees modernity as having a quite different epistemology of the simulacrum, when mechanical reproduction says that the simulacrum does have a value in itself. I know this because I have to buy these shirts for my son, and they're called authentic because they're authorized by Barcelona Football Club, even though they're obviously copies. And then Baudrillard's claim is that in post-modernity, the distinction between simulacrum and referent is lost. And he will talk about, Disneyland is Disneyland. It doesn't represent anything else. What I found doing this project and actually being involved in this process is that the simulacrum worked. That as much as I tried to tell people that the translations were valid and good and should be trusted and translators should be appreciated, the press raised a public outcry, drew attention. Translation has never had so much attention as it has had in the past few months in the state of Victoria in Australia, and drew the attention of politicians to the problem. There's another item there. What happened was that the politicians got, their attention was drawn. They looked at that. They said, we have to solve this problem. They got, I think, 43 million Australian dollars and threw that at the problem. And how did they spend that? Well, not actually on doing translations. They spent it the best way they could, getting people, about 1,000 of them, who speak various languages of the community, to go door to door and have a conversation with the people whose behavior had to be changed. And through that conversation, we managed to eradicate COVID-19 49 days ago. I might 49, I don't know, a bit more. I managed to get home to Perth. I got home to Western Australia. That's how successful it's been. I'm the stupid academic. I'm the one who wanted to get truth in there. I wanted to tell some truth about translation. And I was fighting against the people who were actually publishing my words and getting attention drawn to them. They were right and I was wrong. And perhaps Baudrillard is still stronger than I think he is. The simulacrum, the representation of what was happening in translation, managed to improve the translation services being offered in this particular situation. That is an extreme case of a multimedia transmedial turn. I thank you very much.